Hey folks, Keith here. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of go through some things I think about when I do film grain and color grading. I'm going to be working in DaVinci Resolve, mostly because that's what I know really, really well. But the theories, the techniques will work in pretty much any decent grading software that'll allow you to kind of choose out Luma masks, which we'll get into here in a second. First thing I want to do is I want to just kind of look at an example of a there we go. We'll look at an example of film. All right, so Phantom Thread, Paul Thomas Anderson film, was recently shot on Kodak stock, Vision 3. He shot 200 tungsten and I think something else. Let me take a look at the screenshot here, the technical specifications. Let's see, he shot it on Panaflex. Yeah, Vision 3 200 tungsten and Vision 3 500 tungsten. So at least on the negative format as provided on IMDb. Take that for what it's worth, but I'm going to guess that they put that up there. So, modern stock, but fairly high noise because it's high ISO kind of stuff, 200, 500. So you're going to see a bit of a pronounced noise pattern. And that's something that stood out to me as I watched the film in the theater, is that there is an embracing of the film grain inside of this. This is just a still. I took it from a trailer online. And if you take a look at the film grain, you see that it's quite noticeable in what I call the mids, the mid-highs, the mid-lows, in that range. Once you get to the highs, it's there, but not quite as much. In darks, it kind of just, it's there, but once you get to darks, it's gone. And a lot of times what you'll see with digital photography or digital cinematography is stuff in the darks has more noise than film does. It's kind of a weird thing I've noticed. So when I'm grading something and I want to emulate the filmic impression of film grain, at least, there's a lot of things that go into a color science curve, fall off, all that jazz. But just talking about the noise aspect or the film grain aspect of it, I try to keep in mind that these varying Luma values have different noise response or grain responses to them. So going over to color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate with the qualifier. I'm going to go over to the third dot to the right. This is just for luminance, and I can pick something in that luminance range, and if I hit Shift H, I'll see that I can kind of dial in what my luminance range is, and so on the low side and the high side. So you see that it's in the mid highs. Okay, it's 50 to 70% range. You'll see that there's a fairly strong noise response. If we reset that and we pick, say, something a little higher up, you'll see that the noise response in the 70 to 80 range it starts to fall off quite a bit, which is interesting. So I'm just looking at, this is a 0 to 100 area like that. You can see that on the scopes anyways, what I picked is pretty much everything above halfway point, but fairly strongly above halfway point. You see it's all, there's some varying things in there. If I bring this up, it starts to it isolates what's seen in here. And you can see there's grain in there, but it's not as pronounced as if we did the mids. Now if we do the lows, let me find a low that actually has some noise to it, somewhere in this range right here. You see that's all down there pretty hard. The lows and again the 50 to 60 range, but that's if we get down a little bit lower, we're kind of down in this space right here. You see a lot of this business, and there's noise down there, but it kind of gets lost. You can still see it on the edges, but it's there. So just looking at it, here's a great spot where you can kind of see all of them together. So you got some noise in this dark pants thing. It kind of goes down to pure black fall off down here. Here's your mid-lows. You see there's a fairly decent noise or grain response. Your mid-high, you see it, but then here's your high. And so in this one spot, you see kind of the range of how the luminance values affect how the grain responds. Again, it's in all of them, but it's not in all of them to the same degree. So my kind of order of thinking is mid-lows are going to be the strongest, mid-highs will be the second strongest, darks, and kind of in that same space. It's sort of like a fall off, like a bell curve, if you will, where the peak of the bell curve of grain response will be a mid-low. all right, mid to mid-low. That's really just kind of bang right there. And then as it goes to the high side, it kind of curves off, and as it goes to the low side, it kind of curves off. Again, it never goes to zero, but it's just like the peak of this bell curve of grain response is going to be right smack in the mids, mid to low, mid to high. But I generally think, just from my observations, that the mid-lows tend to carry the strongest signal. So having observed that, and you can see it, and if you just study this frame, it's all over the place. Here's a mid-high. You'll see it's decent grain response. Getting into the high right here, it starts to be less. Get into this black, it's kind of gone. You get into this mid-lows, you see it's really quite pronounced. All right, and then you start getting into lows, and it's fairly pronounced. But the deep darks, you kind of get lost. I mean, that's fine, but you see it pretty much all over. And again, this film is just literally crawling with it. And if you're not used to that, if you're used to looking at just the pure, wind-driven snow, super uber clean technical digital picture that we shoot a lot these days, it can be pretty jarring until you get used to it. To look back and watch a film that was actually filmed on film stock and see the grain response and see how it's embraced. Okay, enough of that analysis. Now let's get into how I actually go about the business of doing this myself. Got some RE footage here, just some RE test footage, messed around with it. And this is just with, brought the exposure down because this was a sample that was overexposed a little bit. And just through the RE, log C to Rec 709 LUT on both of them. Not my favorite LUT. The greens are a little too nuclear for my taste, but whatever the case may be. The reason why I chose is because there's no emulated noise or grain response inside that LUT. So we're not seeing any more grain than what the sensor itself picked up when it's shot. These are fairly clean stuff. But you'll see if we zoom in here, you'll start to see, even with nicely exposed, you'll see these mids have a decent grain response to them, where the mid-highs, oops, we got to get back here to this guy right there, our mid-highs still have it, but as we get a little higher, it gets less responsive. As you get into darks, again, it's sort of like that mid has that, and that's true even on sensor, which is really interesting, but that's pretty small little deal right there. So let's say we wanted to boost this up a little bit, really give this the over-the-top film grain vibe, okay? So there's a couple of ways you can do this. I'm going to give you the way that works, even if you're using the free version of DaVinci Resolve or even anything else. This is just, the idea is you create a node that has a selection mask that's Luma based, and you make one for lows, mids, and highs, and you have some crossover to them. So in Resolve, I just have an empty node right here. If you hit Control P on a PC or Option P on a Mac, you create a parallel mixer. These are really good for kind of like putting things together and not having them fight with each other too much. So I make 3 of them, and I change the label to I'll call this one high, call this one mid, and we'll call this one low. Really imaginative naming right here, I know, but here we go. All right, so what I want to do with this is I want to add film grain to it. So a couple ways we can do that. First, we're going to create the Luma mask. The Luma mask is pretty simple. Again, just like we picked, we're going to go to the third dot on the qualifier where we're just doing luminance, and we're going to pick something that's, I don't know, mid-ish. We'll say right around here is mid-ish. That looks like a pretty decent guess on my part. Looks like a lot of that's sitting right in the mids. So, good guess. Okay, we'll go to this guy, and we're going to pick high. So we'll pick cloud. Another good guess, all right? But I did that for the low, so let's go ahead and do that for the high. We will reset this guy. No, reset all of you. The whole dang thing. There we go. Oh, I also didn't do that with just the luminance. Anyway, so we'll do the low. The low will be, oh, this is really low right here. All right, that's probably a bit much, so we'll bring a bit more in there. You'll see that there's some overlap to it between the mids and the lows and stuff like that. And the low, you can just bang that all the way down to the bottom. But again, it's a fairly highly exposed clip, so you're not going to have a lot of information down here. Okay, and then the high, we'll pick a cloud. Oops, again, we wanted to not do it there. We wanted to do it to the luminance, not just to the color. All right, there we go. So there's our high. All right, it's got the sky in there too. We can probably bring that up a little bit so there's a little less sky, and we're dealing mainly with the highs, you know. Now, with Resolve, you can also play with the softness, you know. That's just basically how much they cross over each other on the boundaries. And then the high, we'll just go ahead and jank that all the way to the top because we're going to cover everything from that point above. We don't really care. Again, because the Alexa is so good at capturing dynamic range and squeezing it into the log, we don't really have any, there's no blown out stuff in here if you look at the scopes. It's really nice footage. All right, so we go to our mids. So this is all isolated, and we know this is what we got. So those are our 3 nodes. They're already set for a Luma mask, and they're there to help us. I'm going to bring this low just a little bit more, and then we'll take the high soft. We'll just kind of, there we go. All right, so we bring up our effects, and a couple ways you can do this. If you have film grain that you have like footage of, you could use that as a layer. I'm not going to get into compositing in DaVinci Resolve because it kind of stinks. If I had film grain footage, like stock film grain footage shot on a green or a gray screen, I'd probably do this work in After Effects. You can do the same sorts of things just using After Effects type tools, just because After Effects is better at blending stuff. Resolve, not my favorite cup of tea as far as like layers and blending, just for a lot of reasons. So in this instance, use something that a lot of people have, which is Film Convert. All right, so I'm going to use Film Convert on these guys. It's a reasonably decent plugin. A lot of people have it. It's not super expensive. And the nice thing about it is I'm going to ignore pretty much everything about the color and the curve. I'm just going to work with the grain. It's great for adding film grain in a reasonably unassuming sort of way. So I'm going to do the same thing there and same thing there. Now you can also, if you have Studio, you can use the film grain deal here, and we'll get in that at the end in case you have the Studio version of this. Okay, so looking at our mids, we'll get in here and we'll see that we've added quite a bit of noise in there, okay? And we've also got the film color. So I don't care about the film color, I don't care about the film curve. In this instance, we're just talking about grain, okay? Let's say you've graded the thing out, it looks the way exactly you want it, the only thing you want is a touch of grain. So use Film Convert and just take the color and the curve down to nothing. And then you can pick, you know, the size of the grain based off of, you know, what size film stock you're using. You'll notice that Super 8 has much bigger grain. That's because it's a much smaller physical piece of material. Film grain tends to be fairly constant in size. The difference is it shows up differently on screen because we're either projecting something that's this big or something that's that big, or if we're doing 65 or IMAX, something that's that big. The grain structure on IMAX is very, very fine because it's a larger physical area, and just like the little crystalline things that create film grain from the developing process, they're fairly uniform across all sizes. They just show up differently because just think of it as just a smaller plate for just the same amount of food. Looks kind of bunched up. So 16 millimeter, you can do all kinds of things. And the neat thing about this is if you really want to push this idea of like certain ranges have more, you can actually choose, although it's faking it, you can choose like a Super 16 film grain size for your mids to get a really, really strong noise structure or grain structure. And then for your highs, you can just, you know, use something like 35 millimeter full frame or Super 35, which is, it's still there. You see it's still there, but it's much less pronounced than that stuff, okay? And then the lows, again, I don't care about, in this instance, the color or the curve. I just want, you know, pretty decent thing. And again, we'll choose, you know, Super 16 for this one to make it, sorry, no, this one we want Super 35. So the mid is really strong. I want that to be the strongest version of the grain. You notice that the cutoff here is pretty sharp, so we can play with that. We can do, you know, your blur radius, kind of soften it. I usually just mess with the low soft and the high soft to kind of, you know, give it some fall off, and then you can do, you know, clean black, clean white, and all these other little fun little finessing things, in out ratios. You know, you can play with it. Typically, the blur radius is going to do a lot of work for you, so you get some crossover between the 2 or 3 of them. So if I turn off all of these highlights, we'll now see, just go ahead and hide this library. We'll take this guy reasonably full screen. You'll see that there's a pretty strong grain response exactly where I wanted it. But you see it's a non-uniform grain response. You'll see here in the mids it's very strong, and here in the highs it's lower. Okay, and as we fall off to the higher stuff, it does kind of disappear a little bit. We can actually make, if you really want to have super fine control, you can even make other selectors for different ranges. Like you can do this Luma thing 10 times if you want. I thought that's probably a bit of overkill. Most I've ever done is 4, mostly so I can get a different fall off, or 5, sorry, like a pure white where there's nothing and a pure black where there's nothing. But you see that just across this image, we've got a couple different places where, you know, the darks not quite so much, the mids have a little bit more, the highs have less, and that's kind of how you get it. And it's, I mean, you can get right in there. It's fairly in your face. But, you know, no less so than, again, if you saw Phantom Thread in the theaters, it struck you right away just how present the film grain is. And that's fine. It's a style choice. It's neither. There are people who get caught up on technicalities, like it's technically better if there's no noise. Well, I mean, it depends what your goal is, right? That's like saying it's technically better if it's blue. I don't know. Is it supposed to be blue? That's your choice as the artist. So none of these, I don't get caught up in like, well, the proper exposure is this, and you know, well, you should never have that. And I don't buy into that mindset, because a lot of the great cinematographers of the past would have failed so many of these tests that technical people and scopes people tend to get really focused on. There is what I call the comfort of the numeric. I know I'm doing a good job if all my things follow the numeric rules. That's not art. That's science. It's something else. Still great and wonderful, and it's good to know those things, but I play with them all the time. So there you go. And then we can kind of do the same sort of thing right here with this guy. And I think we're going to try that. We'll just go ahead and just for funsies, we'll just go ahead and borrow the grade. Oh, I got to bring up my clips. We'll borrow the grade from this guy and turn clips off, and we'll see we got some noise here on our lovely little cow. She's beautiful. She's happily eating the grass. All right, so the lows have some. The mids you'll see quite a bit stronger. And then the highs, you notice it just kind of falls off. But it's still there. And it's a nice, pleasing thing. Now, again, those greens are super hot and nuclear, but that's just the Rec 709 for you. So that's the basics right there of how I do it. I just create a Luma mask. Again, if we take a look at these and go into isolation, we'll see we got the highs, the mids capture quite a bit, and then the lows, not so much, but it's a fairly bright day, okay? It's that Shift H to be able to see what each of these nodes is doing as far as their masking goes on. And then you got the whole deal. Again, working in a parallel mixer will allow these things to work together without necessarily canceling each other out or stomping on each other. And then from here, you can do other things after this. I'm assuming this is your grade that you want, yada, yada. So this is just your, this group right here is your film grain solution. And you can select them all, and a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just create a compound node, and I'll just call, you know, change the label to it, and I just call it CMPD for compound, short, because these icons are small, and I just put, you know, grain on it. And I know that that's my solution for film grain. And if I don't want that on, you know, I can just disable it hitting Command D, or I forget what it is on a PC. I don't have it in front of me right now. So you can see, you know, when I turn it on, you look at the scopes, there's quite a bit softer. That's adding the noise, just an organic deal. All right, so enough of that. How do we do this if we want to go ahead and do this with the film grain deal? So we'll just go ahead and select this. Let's go back to this other piece. This one's a little bit easier to work with. Take all these, create a compound node, and I know what it's going to be. Oh, also, if you ever want to get back in there and work on it, just go decompose compound node and opens it back up again. It's a good way to keep your node tree from getting stupid on you. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll make a new deal here. Not there. We're not going to do it there. Take that guy, turn him off, and then after this we'll do a node. We're going to put the film grain on this node right here. Okay, so looking at this node, we got the film grain settings in, this is what's available for the film grain plugin in DaVinci Resolve Studio, if you want to spend a couple $100 for it. And you'll see it's got, you know, it adds a bit more grain to it. Now you can really play around this quite a bit. The opacity, you know, again, very similar things. You know, you have a couple more film stocks to work with, but again, if you want super grainy, choose 8mm 500. That means it's a 500 ASA tungsten thing for 8mm. It just like digital sensors. If you're shooting high ISO and film, you're gonna have a lot of grain. So that's a good way of thinking about it. So you see that's very, very strong. It's a little nutty. So in this instance, we're just going to go ahead and choose 35mm 200. Okay, that's what the phantom thread stuff was. All right, so we got some noise in there, and it does a pretty decent job of actually working a lot of this stuff out for you. But you can punch this even more if you want, just right here inside the plugin. So take the opacity. We're going to turn the opacity way up just for fun. You can see that the grain is that. Now, generally, I'm not a huge fan of colored grain. I'll take the saturation typically down to nothing or very, very low. I know that's not accurate, but I just like it. It's feels less mudgy to me for reasons. Mudgy's a word. Look it up. Okay, don't look it up. I have no idea where the Urban Dictionary will take you on mudgy. It's just the word I use. But anyways, you'll see, again here, looking at this area, darks are decent, mids are strong, mid-highs less so, highs less so, and then we start falling off into the whites and very, very little, okay? The response is very, very typical to film, so the plugin's actually pretty good. You can push it more if you want. Down under here, under the advanced controls, you have where you can make the shadows ones, the mid ones, or the highlight ones different strengths. So take the mids and you jank those all the way up to 1, you'll see very, very strong. I would not recommend doing that unless you bring this down. But if you leave this at 0.5, you can really play with the mid grain. As I jank that up to 1, you'll see that there's a stronger response in the mids. And as I reset it, I don't know. Hopefully trust me. Hopefully the compression isn't killer on this. It probably should be good to download this video directly, anyways. So you can play around with it in this little slider right here and not have to use the Luma mask thing, because it's kind of got a Luma mask deal built in. Saves you some time, right? So it's not a bad thing. And again, if you wanted to do the trick where you use different film stocks, at different Lumas, you would still need to break out, multiple parallel nodes and do a Luma mask. At which point, whatever. So that's up to you as to how you want to do it. That's my take on film grain. You can go nutty with film grain and really have a lot of different things to it. And again, it's just a choice in the artist's toolbox. So if you really wanted this grainy, you could go super grainy with it, and it'll be okay. And it's still in the highs, and it plays off at the different levels. Film grain is just another palette. It's another brush on the palette. It's not, there's no right or wrong way to do it. There's just different ways to do it. And so this is how I look at it. If I'm trying to do something that feels a little more organic, a little bit more like how film responds, I try to look out for how the grain responds in different Luma places. And hopefully that made sense.